There is healing in the power of the Lord Most High. There is courage in the shadow of His wing. There is peace unending over all my life. There is freedom that washes over me. I find all I need here in Your presence, Lord. I open up my soul and You fill me up with all I need here in Your presence, Lord. Where blessings overflow, there's always abundantly more. There is rest in the goodness of the Lord my God. There is treasure in the kindness of my King. There is comfort in knowing Your unfailing love. My provider, You set my spirit free. I find all I need here in Your presence, Lord. I open up my soul and You fill me up with all I need here in Your presence, Lord. Where blessings overflow, there's always abundantly more. More than I could ask or see, more than I could fathom. God, Your love for me is better than I imagined. More than I could ask or see, more than I could fathom. God, Your love for me is better than I imagined. More than I could ask or see, more than I could fathom. God, Your love for me is better than I imagined. Find all that I need. Find all I need in Your presence, Lord. I open up my soul and You fill me up with all I need here in Your presence, Lord. Where blessings overflow, there's always abundantly more. More than I can ask or see, more than I can fathom. God, Your love for me is better than I imagined. More than I can ask or see, more than I can fathom. God, Your love for me is better than I imagined. You're better than I imagined. We worship the God who was. We worship the God who is. We worship the God who evermore will be. He opened the prison door. He parted the raging sea. My God, He holds the victory. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. We shout out Your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is sure prisoners. Now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today, and we won't be quiet. Shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. Shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today, and we won't be quiet. Shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. We won't be quiet. We were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. 'Cause we were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. 'Cause we are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise.
God, thank you for loving us no matter what we do. No matter what happens in our life, God, you'll always be there for us. You'll always be good. And we're so thankful, God. We're so thankful for everything that you've done in our lives. We love you and we praise you. And everybody said, amen.
Morning, everybody. Why don't you go ahead and grab a seat? Thank you so much for being here, for hanging out with us today. Whether you are joining us here on campus or if you're with us online, we're so glad to be here together. We, by the way, if you didn't know this, we put this up on social media yesterday, but we got a huge announcement. We're going to throw it down at the end of the service. It's really, really good. I know it's messed up to like tease it like that, not say anything, but that's how it's going to go down. So make sure, I know sometimes people are like, oh, I got to get to the parking lot first, or I got to get to the restaurant first. I promise you, you will want to stay to hear this. It's good stuff. So, but before that, we are continuing our series through the book of Romans. And Romans is a book in the New Testament. It's actually a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Rome. And we've been in Romans for a while, and we're going to continue for the next, I think, 4 or 5 weeks or so. But where we're at in the book of Romans is we're kind of at this really transitional point where the first 8 chapters of the book of Romans, Paul really spends like laying out his explanation of Christian faith, what it's all about. It is the most like theologically comprehensive explanation of the Christian faith in the New Testament. And so now, beginning with chapter 9, Paul's going to start to move to the more practical part of the letter, where he's going to say, okay, because of all of this, here now is how we should live. And I would argue that actually the latter part of the letter is the emphasis of it. This is what Paul really cares about. How do we live? That because of what is true, here's how we should live. And so Paul begins this part, this like kind of practical part of the letter, by addressing something that for him is very, very personal. Paul is known as the apostle to the Gentiles. And so back in the first century world, in a Jewish mind frame, which Paul himself is Jewish, there are Jews and there are Gentiles. Gentiles is everyone who's not a Jew. It's just a way of referring to, hey, here's everyone who's like different from us. And so when the church first begins, it begins within the context of Judaism. Jesus is a Jew, his closest followers are Jews, and so when the church first starts, it's this kind of Jewish thing. But then Jesus makes it clear throughout his life that it's not ever supposed to be just a Jewish thing. This was always like for the whole world. This was always for the Gentiles. And so Jesus crosses a lot of barriers to reach out and engage Gentiles. And even after Jesus' death and resurrection, his followers kind of start to do it, but they're really struggling with it. So this is where Paul enters the story. And Paul actually, Jesus appears to Paul and says, hey, here's the mission that I have for you. You're going to be the one that breaks this thing out of its Jewish roots and engages a much larger Gentile world. So this is why Paul becomes known as the apostle to the Gentiles, because that's his mission. Paul, yes, you are a Jewish guy, you're a Jewish man, you understand this context, you understand this background, but you're going to spend your life getting this thing out to the larger Gentile world. And so that's what Paul does. He travels all over the Roman Empire, tells people about Jesus, starts churches. A lot of them become mostly Gentile churches. As Paul travels from city to city, his strategy is usually the first thing he'll do is he'll go into a Jewish synagogue and he will talk to the people there. Because of Paul and his academic credentials and his Jewish credentials, they will allow him to speak. And he speaks about Jesus, and for the most part, the Jews that he speaks to reject him. Not completely, but for the most part, the Jews reject him, and then he goes out and works with the Gentiles and starts kind of these thriving Gentile churches. So Paul gets this name, the apostle to the Gentiles. And he'll actually refer to himself as that in Romans 11. He'll say, yeah, this is who I am. This is my life. This is my mission. But as much as Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, remember he is a Jew, and he loves his people. He loves his heritage, he loves his tradition, and so every time he goes to these cities and talks to these synagogues about Jesus, and for the most part, by and large, the Jewish people reject Jesus, it pains Paul. And so Paul's going to talk about that a little bit. He's going to talk about his heart breaking over for the most part, the Jewish response to Jesus. And so here's where Paul begins in Romans 9. He writes this. He's going to put it up here any minute. I can feel it. He says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my own people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs is the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple, worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all. And so Paul begins just kind of by sharing his heart and saying, look, my heart breaks. Like, it breaks on behalf of my people. Paul says, I would literally gladly sacrifice myself for the benefit of my people. If they would follow Jesus, if they would listen to that truth, if they would believe that he was who he says he was, and if they would spend their life following him and pursuing him. And then Paul goes on, he says, because here's why. Like, what breaks my heart is that the Jewish people who, before they were known as Jews, they were called the nation of Israel, and before that, they were known as Hebrews. Those are all different ways of referring to the same kind of like group of people. Paul says the reality is what God started began in them. And this is where we kind of get the understanding that Paul's not just writing this middle section of Romans to kind of share his own heart and anguish. There's a practical reason that Paul's doing it. Paul's going to spend Romans 9, 10, and 11 addressing this issue, not just because it's personal for him, but also because it raises a very serious question in the minds of the audience that Paul's writing to. And for Paul to avoid that question would have been to leave them lingering with a big dilemma. And here's the dilemma the Roman church has. Paul has spent the first 8 chapters of Romans talking about how awesome God is and how faithful God is and how loving God is and how far God is willing to go to engage people and to save people. If that's true, if God is so good and if God is so faithful, then why have his people rejected him? Because this is what Paul points out. Paul says, look, they were the ones that were initially chosen. That God came to this guy Abraham, and out of Abraham created the nation of Israel. And they were the ones that originally partnered with God, and they were following God, and they were following God's purposes. And if God is so great, if God is so loving, why have his historic people, for the most part, rejected him? And so this is why Paul's addressing this. On one hand, it's very personal for him because his heart breaks over the spiritual condition of his people. But on the other, it's a question that the Roman audience is struggling with. The Roman audience is made up, by the way, of both Jews and Gentiles. There's both groups in there. And that's the question they're asking. If God is so faithful, why have his historic people abandoned him? And so this is what Paul's going to answer. And so Paul starts talking. He says, yes, Paul acknowledges that in the beginning, God chose Israel, and they were the ones that God revealed himself to, and they got the temple, and they got God's presence, and they got the commandments, and God did all that stuff through Moses and through all the prophets. Yes, that's true. And what Paul's going to go on to argue, and he's going to kind of go back and make his way through Israel's history, is Paul's going to go on to argue that what God started in Israel is still going on. That Jesus isn't some break in God's plan, that what God began in Israel, in Abraham, has continued on through Jesus and through the church. That God's work has not failed. Everything that God said he was going to do through Israel, ultimately he's done and he's continuing to do. The work that God started in the nation of Israel, in the Jewish people, is still carrying forward. And so you see this, if you skip to verse 8, here's what Paul writes. He says, it's not as though God's word has failed. He wants to make that clear. That whatever the Jewish response is to God, whatever the Jewish response is to Jesus at this point, it's not because God has failed. It's not because God has done something wrong. It's not because God didn't do what he said he was going to do. God has not failed. For not all who are descended from Israel are Israel, nor because they are all his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary. Next one. Woo, here we go. There we go. It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. In other words, Paul says, it is not the children by physical descent who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. And so I just want to warn you, this middle part is kind of loaded, it's kind of heavy, sometimes hard to understand, but Paul is making a point here, and it's a point that his first century audience would have got. And here's Paul's point. In this section, Paul's referencing Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel. And what Paul's pointing out is that Abraham actually has two kids. He has Ishmael and he has Isaac. Now, if you read the story of Abraham in Genesis, God promised Abraham and his wife Sarah that they would have a son. That son was Isaac. That promise took a long time to come to fruition. And so in the midst of waiting, Abraham actually went outside of his marriage and slept with another lady and had Ishmael. So Ishmael is Abraham's genetic descendant. It is his son. However, it is not the son that God promised. Isaac is the son that God promised. And so everything that God promised to Abraham was passed on to Isaac. And so this is Paul's point. Paul's saying, listen, it was never purely about ethnicity and race. The people of God were never confined to, you have to be a part of this ethnic group and this people group. Even if you go back to the very beginning, as far as Abraham, it was always about what defined the people of God was that they were the people that were living the promises and the purposes of God. That's even from the beginning. Yes, even though God created Israel. See, I think sometimes we forget that God didn't choose Israel, he created Israel. That when God chose Abraham, Abraham and his wife Sarah were barren. And they only had a child because of a miracle. So God doesn't choose them, he creates them. And they are the inheritors of the promise. And so even from the beginning, the people of God were never defined strictly by this ethnic thing where it's only you. No, the people of God were those who lived the promises and the purposes of God. And Paul ends up going on and he gives a few more examples from Israel's history to make this same point. That the people of God are those who inherit and live by the promises and purposes of God. And then in verse 22, he writes this. He says, what if, and so Paul's now kind of painting this picture. What if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath, prepared for destruction? What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory, even us, whom he also called not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles? Now again, we might have read that and some of you are going, I don't even understand what that just said, because it's kind of confusing. But here's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, look, it's really easy to look back at the story of Israel and to interpret that story as God comes to Abraham and he picks Abraham because he likes Abraham better and he likes the Jewish people better, and so he chooses to act and save the Jewish people and then ultimately just destroy all the Gentiles. Paul's saying, look, it's really easy to look back and to have that interpretation. But Paul's point is, what if that's wrong? What if the whole reason that God chose the Jewish people was ultimately to save the Gentiles? What if that, because again, if you go back into the Abraham story, this is what God tells Abraham. One of the promises is all people on earth will be blessed through you. That Israel always has this global purpose. And this is what Paul's wanting to point out. Paul's saying, listen, what we're missing in this is the whole reason God chooses Israel is to the benefit of the world, is to the benefit of the Gentiles. And then this is where Paul kind of throws the whole thing backwards and he says, if that's true, if God chose Israel to the benefit of the Gentiles, what if he's doing the reverse now? What if it seems like he's choosing the Gentiles to the benefit of Israel? What if God's whole point in all of this is he's busting this whole thing out, this movement out? The people of God is no longer bound by this one ethnic group, but now it's for everybody. And what if part of the whole goal in that is the salvation and the restoration of God's historic people, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel? And so Paul's making this argument that, look, a lot of times it seems like God chooses one person because he favors them. But Paul's whole point is, if you go back in Israel's history, God's promises, God's mission, God's goal has always been universal. It's never been about one person. Even when God chooses one person, even when God chooses one people, the reason that he does it is to benefit everyone. That was always the goal. That was always the plan. That the mission of God from the very beginning, from the opening, has always been a universal mission. That what he's up to is he's up to the saving and restoring of all creation and all people. So Paul says, don't get lost in all these little details and think, well, God likes this person better, he likes these people better. The reason he chooses people and groups of people is to the benefit of everyone. Paul goes on to point out, he says, and let's remember, not every single Jewish person has abandoned Jesus. Not every single Jewish person has rejected Jesus. Paul pointed out earlier that, look, Jesus was a Jew. He came out of the Jewish people. He is a Jewish, and not every Jew has rejected him. Paul refers to himself and this other group that he calls a remnant. He says there is a remnant of us, of the historic people of God, that we continue to be a part of what God is up to through Jesus. Paul says, but even for those Jewish people that have rejected Jesus, they still have hope. Romans 11, verse 11 through 12, Paul says this. He said, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Are they lost forever? Paul says, when I go into these synagogues and when I teach people about Jesus, and they reject me and say, no, we don't believe Jesus was God, get that out of here, you're a heretic. Paul says, is God done with them at that point? When I walk away, is God like, well, I'm going to strike all them dead and they're all going to burn forever? And is that God's response? Paul says, no, not at all. Not at all, with the little exclamation point. Paul makes that statement emphatically. God is not done. He's not abandoning people. See, as humans, we tend to abandon people pretty quickly. Paul says God doesn't abandon people. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? And again, this is where Paul is making that same point. He's saying, look, God's plan has always been universal. And if you look to the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, which is essentially the story of ancient Israel, and it shows the story of the people of God as Israel, and their walk and their journey with God, and their ups and downs, and their highs and lows, Paul says, don't read that as if the point was only Israel. The point was always universal. The point was always Gentiles. Paul says now, when you get to where we are now, where Jesus shows up, he dies and resurrects, he says he is the Son of God, and you have, for the most part, God's historic people, Jews, rejecting him, and now Gentiles are embracing Jesus, and the church is now primarily being led and is made up of Gentiles. Paul says, don't look at that and think, well, God has turned his back on the Jewish people, and he's done with them, and now it's all Gentiles. Paul says, no. The goal was never one or the other. It wasn't, I pick you until you turn your back on me, and now I come to you. God's not like best offer God. The goal was always universal. That through the Jews, God was seeking the salvation of Gentiles, and now through the Gentiles, God is seeking the salvation of Jews. That it's not one or the other, it's both. And Paul's going to use this metaphor to kind of make his point, and the metaphor he's going to make is grafting branches. I don't know if you're familiar with grafting branches. Here's a picture of kind of what grafting branches looks like. If you're anything like me, pretty much anything I plant dies. It's just, I don't know, I think it's a family curse because it was kind of true of my parents. So I'm not like, I try to plant things and I try to do gardening and stuff like that. I'm just terrible at it. So I don't know a whole lot about grafting. But here's how grafting works. Grafting is literally taking two different plants and putting them together. And so in this case, I'm not sure what kind of plants these are, but you can see like this branch is one kind of tree, these branches are another kind of tree. And so when you graft, you literally cut the branch off and you take branches from another tree and you connect them in such a way as to where they will keep growing. So in a sense, you've kind of created a hybrid. Because now whatever this plant is, it's drawing nourishment from this other different plant, and you've created kind of this new hybrid plant thing. And here's the analogy Paul makes. Paul says, listen, Israel was the original plant, the plant that goes all the way to the ground. Israel was the root. With the Gentiles, now what God has done is he has grafted in new branches. He's grafted in a whole, which takes some work. It's not an easy thing. But God has grafted in these new branches and is creating this whole new plant. He's creating this whole new family. He's creating this whole new tree. But Paul then goes on to make the point. Paul says, listen, if God can graft in a completely different plant, he can also graft in the old plant back to itself. That God isn't done with Jewish people. He never abandoned Gentile people. Again, the goal was always both. That whatever it is God was up to, it was always universal. And even now, God is trying to create this beautiful, multicultural, multi-ethnic tree. And he's patient with everyone. And his plan is for everyone. And he's willing to do whatever work he has to graft everyone in, to make everyone a part of what he's up to. And so what Paul's doing really for us, if you look at it, is Paul's bringing continuity between the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, and the second part of the Bible, the New Testament. Sometimes we look at those two testaments and they seem drastically different if you're familiar with them at all, because again, the Old Testament is all about Israel and the nation of Israel, and it ends with kind of Israel's fall, and there's a little bit restored, but not really. So it's kind of the rise and fall of Israel. And then the New Testament picks up with Jesus and his followers and the church. And so sometimes you look at it and go, these are two totally different stories. The Old Testament is also known as the Hebrew Bible. It's those scriptures that are held sacred by the Jewish tradition. And the New Testament serves as really the foundation of the church and how the church functions. So sometimes you look at it and go, these are two totally different things. What Paul is doing is he's connecting them. He's saying, listen, what started in Israel continues in the church. That Jesus isn't some deviation that God was moving along. God's like, oh, well, that didn't work. Let's do something else. That God always knew what he was doing. And ultimately, Jesus is the fulfillment of everything God set out to do in Israel. Paul actually will write to the church in Corinth in another letter that we have in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians. He'll say this. Paul writes and he'll say, for no matter how many promises God has made, they are yes in Christ. Christ is it's a term used to describe Jesus. That Jesus is the way that God said yes to everything he was going to do in Israel. This is why when like the New Testament writers talk about Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament, they don't mean that like every single thing that was said, every single verse in the Old Testament is a reference to Jesus. That's not their point at all. Their point is everything God said he was going to do in Israel, he accomplished in Jesus. And so even though when you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, when you look at Israel and when you look at the church, they look like drastically different things and they seem completely different, they are a continuity of the same mission. That the work that God began when he first called Abraham and said, I'm going to create a people, that work and those promises continue on through the person of Jesus and into the life and the ministry of the church. And God's goal has always been, and it continues to be, universal. This is a point that Paul's making. And here's the reason he's making it. He's going to tell us why this is so important. Because what Paul's trying to fight against is he's trying to fight against the Gentiles in the church in Rome feeling superior to the Jews in the church in Rome. Because again, you have this church, like a lot of churches at this point, that has both Jews and Gentiles. And the situation in Rome is kind of interesting because several years before Paul writes this letter, the Roman emperor actually kicked all the Jewish people out of Rome, banned them, so they all had to leave. So all of a sudden, overnight, the Jews, who for the most part had led the church, they were gone. It's strictly a Gentile church. After a few years, those Jews were allowed to return. So you have Jewish people now that come back into Rome and come back into the Roman church, but now it's a Gentile-led church. And so now you have this weird conflict where usually in Paul's ministry, you have Jewish-led churches and they're struggling to include Gentiles. Here you have the opposite. You have a Gentile-led church that's struggling to include Jews, and it's really easy for the Gentiles to look down on the Jews and say, well, you were the past. Let's just be real. You were the past. You were God's people back then. You abandoned him. You rejected him. This is our time. And what Paul is making clear is Paul's saying, listen, Gentiles, The only reason you are where you are, the only reason you are experiencing the fullness of life with God is because of the Jewish people. You stand on their foundation, the roots that they put into the ground when they walked with God through the wilderness, when they established the kingdom of Israel, even when they experienced tragic events like the exile. The very foundation of faith has been laid by God's journey with the Jewish people, with the people of Israel. And now you are inheritors of that legacy. And so don't think that somehow you're better than them. And don't for a minute think that God has abandoned them. That God is working just as hard to include them, to graft them in, as he did to graft you in. That this is what God is up to. And so he's trying to remind them of that. So he tells them in Romans 11:25, he writes this, he says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way, all Israel will be saved. Now understand, this is not Paul making a prophecy saying, hey, in the end, all Israel's not going to. That's not it. This is Paul sharing his heart. This is Paul sharing his hope. Paul's saying, this is what I hope for. I hope that when my people, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, when they see what is going on with God and the Gentiles, that they will come back to God, they'll come back to faith, and that ultimately this will result in God saving and restoring all of creation. Paul says, that's my hope. And so in the meantime, Paul says, I do not want you to be conceited. I do not want you to think that you're better. Paul, if you read through the New Testament, Paul wears a lot of different hats. He plays a lot of different roles. He's a church planter, he's a missionary, he's a theologian. What you see here in the middle part of Romans 9 through 11, is you see Paul as a pastor. And what Paul is attempting to do in these 3 chapters is he's attempting to navigate a historic and a potentially divisive issue within the Roman church. The number one issue that the church faced, if you look through the book of Acts, which is a book in the New Testament that tells us about the early church, the number one issue that the church faced was division. And if you look, not even just in Acts, but if you look at some of the other letters that Paul writes, they argue over all different kinds of things. They argue over holidays, and like what holidays you should. They argue over circumcision. They argue over food and what kind of food you can and can't eat. But what's interesting is when you look at those arguments, most of them boil down to a Jew and Gentile divide. That the holidays, the diet, all this, it all had to do with Jews do one thing, Gentiles for the most part do something else. And so you have this kind of division between Jews and Gentiles that manifests itself in different ways in different churches. And in the church in Rome, this is what Paul's trying to navigate, is you have this historic division between Jewish and Gentile people and what they think and what they hope from each other and what they expect from each other, and it's kind of a messy thing, and it goes back years and years and years, and in some ways there's like built-in prejudice against one another. And Paul is trying to help this church navigate that by saying, listen, we're one. That literally God is creating one family. He's grafting us together. He's putting us together. It's not just that we're standing side by side now. It's that we're literally becoming one plant, one people, one family. That out of this potentially like divisive and historic and deep-seated issue, Paul is trying to create unity because he knows that's essential to the survival and the thriving of the church. I want to get pastoral for a minute. Paul kind of spends the middle of Romans in his pastoral moment. I'm going to get pastoral for a minute. This is not going to sound very pastoral, but hang with me. I love Marvel movies. I just do. Not everybody does. I love Marvel movies. Whenever new Marvel movies come out, it's like my son and I, that's our thing. We go to the theater opening day and we watch them. And one of his favorite characters, one of mine too, is Spider-Man. Spider-Man, yeah, there we go, in the back right there. Yeah, Spider-Man. Thor is my all-time favorite, but I do like Spider-Man. The first like standalone Spider-Man movie that came out in the Marvel Cinematic Universe was Spider-Man Homecoming. And this is a picture of a scene from Spider-Man Homecoming. Spider-Man he's in New York, he's out in the harbor, and he's on a boat. It's like a big barge. And the barge ends up through like alien technology getting cut in half. And so Spider-Man slings his web, and he's trying desperately to hold this thing together. You have this boat that he's on that is sinking because you have these two parts that are pushing away from each other. And he's trying desperately with all that he can to like hold this thing together to keep it from sinking. This is kind of what it's like trying to navigate churches in our culture today. I'm not saying this is me, this is Jesus. He looks more like a crown. I'm not saying I'm Spider-Man. Don't hear me wrong. I'm just saying that to me, this is an image of kind of what it's like trying to like live within, and this is not, I'm not just talking about FCC. I'm talking about like churches who are part of our culture, because as a culture, we are so incredibly divided. But there are actually some statistics that show that on some issues, not every issue, but on some issues, the division is actually greater within the church than it is outside of the church. And so, I mean, I talk to pastors like friends, people all over the country, and it's like, it's trying to, you have these two sides that are divided, that are pulling in opposite directions, and how do we stay together? How do we remain as a family? Now, much like Paul in his day, he's dealing with all these issues, circumcision, food, all that kind of stuff. You could look at it and say, oh, well, there's all these issues that we talk about, and we could go through the list of there's this, and that. But really, a lot of those issues, like for Paul, most of the issues he's dealing with deal with the Jew and Gentile divide. For us, if we're honest, and don't get mad at me and don't storm out, let me finish here. A lot of them begin with politics and political ideologies. That we have these political ideologies that kind of guide how we think and what we think, and a lot of the other issues that we argue over, and again, you could list them out, really all stem from that. And so the whole division that we see within the struggle amidst division that you see in the early church, it's not like it went away. As human beings, I think that's always our struggle. Our struggle is always division. Our struggle is always disagreement. Our struggle is always creating us versus them divides. And you see Paul wrestling with it in the early church, and it's something that we continue to wrestle with. And again, in our context, I would argue that a lot of it begins with politics. One of my heroes is a guy named Lesslie Newbigin. Lesslie Newbigin was a British guy, and he was a missionary. He actually went from, I believe, the 1930s to the 1970s. He left his home in Britain, and he went over to India, and he served as a missionary from the 30s to the 70s. Now, just for a minute, I was born at the end of the 70s, so I wasn't alive during that period of time, but just think of what you know about history. Think how much the world changed between 1930 and 1970. So Newbigin leaves Britain in the 30s, spends 40 years in India, then comes back to Great Britain, which Great Britain is a Western nation. It falls under what we call the Western world. And when Newbigin came back, what he realized is, yeah, this isn't the world that I left. It is drastically different. It has changed. And so what Newbigin does is he spends his latter years writing about really theology and church and how the church can navigate the new world in which we find ourselves. And he's written like some classic books. And one of the things that Newbigin recognized, and it's funny when you read it now because it sounds like prophecy, the influence of the church is fading. And as people's like zeal for the church fades, what it's being replaced with is a zeal and a passion for politics. And so his whole point is, listen, politics is taking the place of religion in the Western world. And so in the past, where we used to fight over religion, he said, now we'll fight over politics. And Newbigin warned pretty strongly of the dangers of tying faith, Christian faith, to a specific political ideology, a specific political viewpoint, a specific political party. And here's what he said. This is what he wrote in his book, Foolishness to the Greeks. He said, confusion of a particular and fallible set of political and moral judgments with the cause of Jesus Christ is more dangerous than the open rejection of the claim of Christ in Islam. So that was his argument, that actually saying that, Jesus would back me and my political view, but he said that's more dangerous than just outright rejecting Jesus. He goes on, he says, the sacralizing of politics, the total identification of a political goal with the will of God always unleashed demonic powers. Now that's strong language. That's super strong. Now don't hear Newbigin wrong, because some people take this, and Newbigin never argued that as Christian people we shouldn't be involved politically. He never argued that. In fact, he argued the opposite. He said that as Christian people, you should be involved in the political process because it has to do with how society functions and how everything's governed. He said you absolutely should. Newbigin also argued that you can have good, godly people that act politically across the spectrum of politics. Because here's what he got. Newbigin said, here's what happens when you take God and you tie him specifically to a specific political ideology. Here's why it's so dangerous. Politics at its core is about defeating the other group. That's what you're trying to do. We're right, they're wrong, so we are trying to defeat them. So politics by its nature creates enemies. There are no enemies in the Christian faith. You ever read what Jesus says about enemies? Love your enemies. Pray for those people who persecute you. And so in politics, what you're trying to do is you are trying to beat people. I'm trying to beat you. I'm trying to defeat you. So we end up trying to defeat the people that Jesus is trying to save. Which again goes back to Paul's point with Jews and Gentiles. That you have this like Jew and Gentile divide, and does God love us or does God love them? And Paul's like, look, the goal has always been everybody. And so when we create enemies out of people that God is trying to save, we end up working against God. This is what Newbigin warned us about. This is what Paul understands. Paul understands, I'm going to put this on the screen because I want us to see it. Paul understands that the greatest threat to the mission of the church is disunity. That's the greatest threat to the mission of the church. The greatest threat to the mission of the church is not from outside the church, it is from within the church. Because the church has as its mission to bear witness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's the church's job. We bear witness to the life, death, resurrection, and Jesus. And what Jesus himself said, there's really only one way we accomplish that. There's really only one way that we as a church bear witness to the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. And here it is, John 13:35. By this is Jesus talking, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. That's what Jesus said. You know how you will accomplish your mission? You know how you will bear witness to my life, death, and resurrection? Is you will love one another. It is really difficult to love someone that you are always trying to defeat. See, disunity becomes the greatest threat to the church. It always has been. If you go back into Paul's day and the difficulty he's trying to navigate between Jews and Gentiles and how he's trying to hold that together, the reason why Paul spends so much time on that, Romans is 16 chapters. Paul spends 3 chapters just on that. And actually, he's not even done. He's going to talk more about it in different contexts, but he's going to talk more about it later. The reason Paul spends so much time is because he understands this is what's at stake. Literally, the success of the God-given mission to the church is at stake when it comes to our unity. Because the only way we fulfill our mission is if we love one another. But that requires work. See, I'm going to put the Spider-Man picture up again. This situation right here is only getting worse. The church in this culture is sinking and dying, and it's not, hear me out on this, it is not because of culture wars. It's not because of someone out there. It's because of us. And the only way this situation gets better is if we choose to lean in toward one another instead of pushing other people away. That's the only way it gets better. It doesn't get better from outside. It gets better if we stop pulling and pushing apart from one another and start leaning in. I want to share with you a couple quotes from people that I really admire. Just want us to think about these this week. The first one's from a guy named Bob Goff. And here's what he said. Don't let being right talk you out of being kind. The problem with politics is we care a lot more about being right than we do about being kind. Andy Stanley, who's a pastor in Atlanta, he said this. This one just burns in my brain. He said, when a local church becomes preoccupied with saving America at the expense of saving Americans, it has forsaken its mission. Often unintentionally, we end up working against God because we create enemies out of people that God is trying to save. And this is true of all of us. It's true across the whole spectrum. I don't want anyone to walk out of here and think, oh, he was just attacking this. Or no. The whole thing is jacked up. All of it. And what Paul wants us to see in Romans 9-11 is Paul says, look, you got to look beyond all that and realize what God has always been up to. And what he's accomplishing through the work of Jesus is that he is grafting together all of us from different backgrounds and different viewpoints and different ethnicities and different races and different languages. And he is creating one new plant, one new family, one new people. And we have to care more about that than we do our differences and our disagreements. Because that's the only way the church survives and thrives. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you that you came down to this earth to give your life for us. That everything you had done, going all the way back to creation and the calling of Abraham, all of that led up to your death and your resurrection. You knew where you were going, and you knew what you were working for. You were always working for the universal salvation and restoration of your creation and of all people. And God, that's what you continue to do now. And God, I know we live in a messy time. Life is always messy. And this is a messy time. And we're bombarded with images and ideas and ideologies, and we're told, hey, here's what we should do, here's what we should think. And it's tough to navigate. It is. I acknowledge that. It is not an easy thing to figure out. And sometimes we know where we stand, sometimes we don't know where we stand, but God, I just pray that within the church, as your people, that God, we would stay more focused on what it is that you're doing. That would be our priority, that building your kingdom, that advancing the church, that bringing life and peace, that would matter more to us than being right. That loving and serving other people would matter more to us than winning. And God, it's not an easy fix. It's not like we got here overnight and we're not going to get out of it overnight. But what it takes is intentionality. It takes all of us making the choice that instead of pushing each other away, instead of getting angry, instead of creating enemies, we're going to choose to lean in, even if you tick me off. Even if I disagree with you, we're going to lean in and we're going to love each other in spite of our differences. That's hard. It's really hard. But it's the only way. Father, we love you and thank you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
We're going to sing a couple more songs, so if you'll sing with us, please. Sing this out.
More than I could ask or see, more than I could fathom. God, your love for me is better than I imagined. More than I could ask or see, more than I could fathom. God, your love for me is better than I imagined. More than I could ask or see, more than I could fathom. God, your love for me is better than I imagined.
Why don't you go ahead and grab a seat? I said at the beginning we had a cool announcement. It's announcement time. Before we do that, though, just want to let you know of a couple things. One, if I don't know if this is your first time, you've been here a long time. Like I said, we've been in the book of Romans. We are starting a growth track through the book of Romans, which is something we do that's kind of online, and it's a way to study Romans a little bit deeper. We're going to do some Q&A things that I'll be a part of on Zoom. And so if you want to join our Romans growth track, you can go to fcchb.com, and you can register for our growth track there. It starts tomorrow, so you're not too late. It's going to be a great thing. I think it's 4 weeks long. It's going to be absolutely phenomenal. Also, again, thank you all so much for being here. And just want you to know that when we're done here in a minute, if you would like to take communion, we've got that set up down in our chapel. So if you walk out these doors and go to that end of our campus, there's an A-frame building, big A-frame building. Go in there, there's a communion experience set up there, and you can do that. And then, too, if you come prepared to give, you can give as you leave. There's these boxes. You can give online. So thank you all so much for that. But the big announcement has to do with our Generations campaign. And so some of you may have been around in the fall when we kicked off Generations, some of you weren't. I want to take just a minute to talk about what Generations is and where we're currently at. So Generations was this 2-year initiative that we kicked off in the fall, kind of in November. And Generations was about 3 things. It was about spiritual growth, church unity, and debt reduction. That was our 3 emphases. And for the next 3 years, we were going to focus on these things. And so we have and we continue to kind of launch, and right now we're test driving all kinds of opportunities in terms of spiritual growth and church unity. And so we've been able to do some things this winter and this spring to kind of help with that. Our ministries team is now, they're getting ready to do all kinds of stuff. Again, some of it they're field testing, some of it they're getting ready to launch in the fall. And so I hope that you will continue to look for new opportunities, because we're working hard to create all kinds of new environments that will help us build spiritual growth and church unity. So those are coming. They continue to come. We're still working hard on those. But what I want to talk about this morning real quick is I want to talk about debt reduction. Now, when we started Generations, I kind of gave a quick overview of debt and the history and legacy of debt at our church. Debt has been an issue at our church for like 40 years. And just as a quick overview, here's kind of how our debt has looked over the last 40 years or so. Is we started in debt in 1984 when we built this building. We went $5 million in debt, which just about closed the church. At one time, we were paying 60% of our income toward debt service, and like literally staff members went door to door and knocked on people's door and asked for more money. It was bad, from what I understand. I was 5 and didn't go here, not my fault, but it was bad. Over the next few years, we managed to pay down some of our debt. We also took on a little bit of additional debt, $1 million of additional debt, when we moved our school, Huntington Christian School, our K-8 school, to a new campus. So we actually paid down $3 million, took out another $1 million. So in 2008, we were $3 million in debt. 2008 is when we started the Next Wave project, which is what rebuilt the entire campus. So we began that already $3 million in debt. By the time we came out of that, we were $9.5 million in debt. So I think we raised $15 million or something, and the project was $21 million. We tacked on another $6 million in debt. So as of 2011, we were $9.5 million in debt. Since then, over the 10 years since then, we've been able to pay that down some to get to $6.5 million. That's where we were when Generations began. And so when you look at how that affects our current budget, here's the current payments that we make as a church toward our debt, if you want to put that up here. We pay $41,000 a month. $492,000 a year, and it represents 12.5% of our annual budget. So it's not like this number, if you know anything about mortgages and percentages and stuff, it's not terrible, but it is still a burden, especially over how crazy the economy's been since 2008 till now. I mean, you've had ups and downs and the difficulty of the last couple of years we've been in. This is one number that can't change. We owe the bank. And so it does hinder our current ministry, but more than that, and this was my biggest priority, this debt number represents what I think is an existential threat to the future of the church. Because when you talk about the younger generations, the emerging generations, they are facing the most uncertain economic reality since the Great Depression. So what I told our elders from the day that I took over as lead pastor, which is all the way back in 2013, I said, if we don't eliminate this by the time that I leave, whenever that is, I fear for the future of the church. Because if we pass on our legacy of debt to another generation, I don't know that they will be able to bear the burden that we give them, just because of the economic reality that they will live in. And so what we did with Generations is Generations was kind of our first start to, hey, how can we reduce our debt? Generations was about debt reduction. And our goal was over 2 years, we wanted to pay this principal down by $3 million. We wanted to raise an additional $3 million to pay it down. And then on top of that, with the payments that we would make, we would have cut more down. So if Generations would have been successful, we would have been at $3 million debt in August of 2023, because that's when we have to refinance our loan. So that was always the goal. So we kickstarted that. A bunch of us made pledges. A bunch of us started giving. And so a few months into Generations, here's where we stood in 2022. 5.6. So we paid down about 700,000 or something, or anyway, somewhere in there. My math, I'm not a math person, believe it or not. But that's where we were a few months into Generations. And that was possible because of your sacrifice and your generosity and your giving and your going above and beyond. And I'm just going to tell you right now, this was already better than anything I could have ever imagined. We launched Generations at the worst possible time to do something. Literally, Omicron was surging all over the place. Most people weren't even back at church. We did the best we could, but it was crazy. So the fact that we got here was unbelievable to me. And this is the point then at which it gets like super miraculous. So in the time since Generations closed, we received as a part of a federal government program that was known as the Employee Retention Credit. It's not... There was a loan called the PPP that's not that. That had to go directly towards salaries. Employee retention credit was just part of like COVID relief that was given to organizations. We received $1 million as a part of that program, which was incredible. Then there's a person, an individual that goes to our church as part of our church, and over the last several years has given a large gift above and beyond to go towards special projects. They really have a heart for special projects, and so we talk every year, and they talk about, hey, what are the special projects that aren't in the budget? How can we fund those? How can we get those done? And they've done that for, 4 or 5 years. Every summer they would call and we'd talk through and they would give. And that allowed us to do things for our facility and for our ministry that we weren't able to do in our general budget as giving kind of went down because of COVID. And so they always gave out of the proceeds of their family business. That's what it was. And they came to the end of the year, they would say, hey, here's the proceeds from our family business. Here's what it is. So this time they called me and they're like, hey, we sold our family business. And we're going to give the church $5 million. Yeah. And I cried. I think the only time I've ever cried on the phone when someone called me. And so we talked a little bit more. And again, because they don't have the family business anymore, they obviously won't be giving of the profits to special projects, but they wanted to give this, so they gave us that amount with the heart to do two things: to pay off debt and to continue to do special projects, because we won't have that income that we've had the last several years, so this was like a special thing. So I want to tell you where we stand now and what we have done after talking with this individual and the contribution that they made and talking through with our board and where we're at and where we go from here. So as of right now, we have paid down $5.71 million of our debt, which, yeah. Which represents 700 that we have all given. 4 of it comes from the gift from this individual, and the other $1 million came from that government program. The other $1 million that this individual gave us, we put into a special projects fund that we will use to fund special projects for the next few years. And again, that was done in conjunction with talking with them and their heart to want to be able to do special projects and knowing that we won't get that income anymore. So it's to kind of honor that heart, which means our current debt as we sit right now, and this is like not theoretical, this is true, is $666,988. That's our current debt. Which brings me to a point that debt is the devil. Just kidding. Sorry. Just kidding. But here's the thing, so here's what that means. If we continue to give at the rate at which we have been giving, we will be completely debt-free by August 2023 at the latest, and probably sooner. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty miraculous. And so, sorry, I'm going to get choked up. I'm going to cry again. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for going above and beyond. We are where we are because of all of us. And this individual's generosity, what it has done is change the goalpost. We were literally going for debt reduction. We always knew Generations was the first step. Like, it's debt reduction. We're going to have to figure something else out later on. This now changes the goalpost to we're not reducing it, we're eliminating it to secure the long-term health and viability of First Christian Church beyond when any of us will be here. And so for those of us who have made commitments, for those of us who are giving, I hope that we will continue to give. If you have not made a contribution to Generations, or if you've come since then, or even if you just have questions about it, you can go. I want you to go check out fccHB.com/generations, and it has kind of all the information there. And I think tomorrow, if you go there, there's like a graph outside. We're going to update all that information sometime early this week, so all the new information will be up there so you know. But if you're not a part of it, I would encourage you to be a part of it, because again, it's not about money. It's about how do we build a healthier, better church that we can give to our children and to our grandchildren and to a whole bunch of people that we will never meet. That's what this has always been about. It's about advancing the mission of God in our generation and in future generations. So we're going to close now by singing a song that is a powerful song. It's a great song. It's about God building his church, because at the end of the day, that's always what it's been about. This is God's church, and it's his, and he builds it, and everything we do for his glory. And so I thank you again from the bottom of my heart for your generosity, for your willingness to give, to engage, to be generous. Can't tell you how overwhelmed I am, how excited I am, how much I love you all. By the way, some people were like, when I'm going on sabbatical this summer, like, are you sure you want to come back? I'm like, yeah, I'm come back to Debt Free Church. If y'all were still in debt, maybe I'd think about going, but so it's just, we got a great, great future because all of us came together, and we're all going to get there together, and we're going to finish this thing strong. So let's close today just by singing and celebrating the great church that God is building here.
On Christ alone, our chief cornerstone, no other foundation can we build upon, not philosophy, nor the wisdom of man. All other ground is sinking sand. Sing upon this rock you build your church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. When we bind and loose, we proclaim your truth, and in Jesus' name we will not fail, never fail. Oh, he's building his church now. Crucified, raised up from the dead, let captivity captive. It is finished. Yes, it is. Oh, he gave us the key, his authority. Now we are joined to the praise of his glory. Yeah. Upon this rock you build your church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. No, no. We bind and loose, we proclaim your truth, and in Jesus' name we will not fail. We'll never fail. No, we will never fail. We will never fail. We will never fail. No, we will never fail. We will never fail. Come on, sing that out with us. We will never fail. We will never from the ground up. It's your church. Build your church. Build your church. Build it from the ground up. We're your church. Build your church. Build your church. Build it from the ground up. It's your church. Build your church. Oh, we're your church. Build it from the ground up, 'cause it's your church. Build your church, Jesus. Build it from the ground up upon this rock. We build your church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. When we bind and loose, we proclaim your truth. And in Jesus' name, the precious name of Jesus. Oh, Jesus, build your church. Build it from the ground up, 'cause it's your church. Build your church. Build your church. Build it from the ground up. Build it from the ground up. Build your church. Build your church. Build it from the ground up. Build your church. Build your church. Build it from the ground up. We're your church. Build your church. Build your church. Build it from the ground up. It's your church. Build your church. Oh, Jesus, build it from the ground up. Build it from the ground
We love you guys so much. Thank you for coming, and we can't wait to see you next weekend.